My name is Solimar Salas. I'm the Vice President for Content, Innovation, and Outreach at the Museum of Latin American Art. We welcome you today, Wednesday, May 25th of 2022, to this edition of the MOLAA Zoom Project in conversation with the artist, Delilah Montoya, where Chief Curator Gabriela Urtiaga will discuss with the artist her work and career. MOLAA also acknowledges the support of the Dwight Stewart Youth Fund, the Kenneth T. and Eileen L. Norris Foundation, the Miller Foundation, Josephine S. Gambiner Foundation, and the Arts Council for Long Beach for their constant support of the educational programs at the Museum of Latin American Art. Each chapter of the MOLAA Zoom Project features a conversation between the most remarkable artists from Latin America and Latinx, Latina, Latinos across the United States, and our MOLAA Chief Curator, Gabriela Urtiaga. Together, we focus on a series of specific artworks which require a close inspection, a deliberate process of contemplation and exploration, delving into the ideas surrounding the creation of the works, their sources of research and inspiration, in an effort to immerse ourselves in the world of the artists. In Chapter 21 of the MOLAA Zoom Project, Gabriela Urtiaga will join renowned Chicana artist Delilah Montoya. For artist Delilah Montoya, transforming the past is a communal act in which revered symbols and their mystical and spiritual qualities are reborn in photographic representations. A Chicana artist, Montoya's own personal quest in image making is the discovery and articulation of Chicano culture and the icons which elucidate the dance history of New Mexico. Montoya's is an autobiographical exploration, but one that has far-reaching implications for both her community and the preservation of its unique history. As a Chicana artist, her work is interpreted as an alternative to the mainstream, and it stands as a personal statement that evokes an identity. She aspires to originate the artist's voice. Her work, however, is more than a personal statement, for it is rooted in and informed by history. She has produced a number of bodies of work for women boxers, contemporary casta portraits, Sacred Heart colotypes, and mural-sized Guadalupana installations. In 2021, Montoya was honored with the USLAF Latinx Arts Fellowships. Montoya is an Artadia awardee, as well as a recipient of the Richard T. Castro Distinguished Visiting Professorship. Ms. Montoya's work also resides in the Smithsonian Collections and the LA County Museum of Art. Several of her pieces were in the monumental traveling exhibit, Chicano Art, Resistance and Affirmation. Thank you so much for joining us, you, the audience, and the artist. And now I present Gabriela Urtiaga, MOLAA's Chief Curator, who will take on the rest of this show. Thank you.
Thank you, Solimar, and all the MOLAA team. Hola, welcome to MOLAA. I hope you are well and safe, and thank you for joining us today. Hello, Delilah. It's a real honor to have you with us. Thank you for your time, for sharing a space with us during this sad and terrible moment following yet another gun violence in this country. We really appreciate that you join us today.
Well, thank you. And, you know, I really would like to give my heartfelt, grief to the families that had to endure such a horrible tragedy. Yet again in the United States, really, it's time. We really do need to do something about this uncontrollable gun violence that has been, in the clutches of the United States for so long. It's, at one point you almost feel hopeless. But yeah, I guess maybe what I would like to do is just kind of give it a moment of silence, maybe.
Yes, for sure.
So that we can contemplate. Yeah, but, thank you. Thank you so much for bringing me here. And I'm really excited about talking about some of the work and hearing what people have to say.
Oh, yes, Delilah. Yeah. And well, to start our conversation, as one of the most influential, intellectual, and multidisciplinary Chicana artist, you explore through your body of work different important issues, right? Linking with the past and present of the Americas, the tradition of indigenous heritage, religion practice, the recognition of women identity immersed in the Chicana culture. And from your beginning, you were interested in art, but also in the reparation of history through the power of art, correct? Could you tell us about your beginnings as an artist and also your commitment with the Chicano movement?
Right. Well, I actually had started when I was like a teenager, and I was in a place was in Omaha, Nebraska, living in what would be considered a packing house district. So there was a lot of Mexicanos, Latinos that had come into the neighborhood, where I grew up to, basically work within the packing house district. So, and then along with that came, from Denver came the Brown Berets. And there was a little kind of a community center that was established by the Latinos, the Mexicanos in the neighborhood that was called the Chicano Awareness Center. And the Chicano Awareness Center was in a building that was donated by the Sociedad Mutualista. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Sociedad Mutualista, but I remember there was Jorge, and he was an old man at that. Well, of course, back then I thought he was an old man, but but he had fought within the revolution. I mean, he was that old, right? Of course, I'm that old too. I mean, no, this was back in the 60s. And when he fled Mexico, he went all the way up into Omaha. So it was like people from Mexico that were just, just kind of like moving into all parts of the United States. And I remember him telling me about, what had happened and, what the revolution was like, and, starting the Sociedad Mutualista in Omaha, right? And then when the Chicano movement started, he really connected with that, and he became, kind of a grandfather for all of us, really. Yeah. And one of the things that came along with, like this movement out of Denver was all this art, right? And I started seeing a lot of the art and the poetry and the theater that was being established at that time. And, I connected in with that. And I remember going to high school, and I was taking art classes, and my teacher would ask me, well, do you want to continue going to college to take art? And I was like, I'm going to be a Chicana artist. And she would tell me, like, there's no such thing as Chicano art. I go, yes, there is. And I'm going to be a Chicana artist. All right. Wow. So I guess that's the kind of commitment that I was, at that time, I realized that there was a lot of incongruency in terms of what I was taught in terms of the history, and that I knew was wrong, because my mother is from northern New Mexico, and her reality was so different from what the reality that was being taught to us. So, so part of me was, somehow I wanted to begin to understand, how does this happen, and what is my true identity, right? Yeah, and to begin to kind of look at it and think about, just even knowing her history of kind of like the discrimination that was happening. She would talk about because she was lighter, she was a lighter Latina, and how she would have, as a child, like a 7-year-old would have to go to the store to buy the food because the food was not being sold to her parents. Right, but they would sell to her. Or she would talk about going to a theater, and she would be separated from her family. And she would talk about her just sitting there crying because she couldn't sit with her family. So it was like those kind of kind of racial injustices that, you know, I began to really kind of contemplate and think about. I mean, things like my grandfather who basically he shoveled coal in northern New Mexico. He would shovel coal into a stoker to keep a power plant going to generate electricity. He went home to no electricity. You know, and it was those things that really kind of motivated me to try to kind of like think about, you know, how does this happen in a country where there is so much, right? And there was so much wealth and there's so much opportunities. So yeah, so I think really that's where it started with that.
Yeah. Thank you, Delilah. It's amazing and a real inspiration. And Delilah, I would like to put the focus in one of your early projects, the Codex Delilah, a journey that you create from a journey to Mexico to Chicana from 1992, where you have created a marvelous artist book telling the story of a young girl who started a spiritual and symbolic travel through the time and space, rethinking the European and Native encounter and the impact on it in this land. Can you explain a little more about this marvelous job?
You know, this was done, the Chicano Codices was done for a show that opened up in San Francisco in 1992, which is 500 years of occupation. And what they wanted us to do was to kind of think about that occupation. And at the time I was taking a lot of Mesoamerican art, and I took a course on the codices from Mesoamerica. And I really fell in love with the Codex Dresden in the way that it was looking. Yeah, I learned things about like how the codices had no foreground or background, but it took on like the 3 different realms. And one would be the deity realm, and then there was like the secular, and then there was the underworld that was kind of like a part of that. So what I did with this one is, one, I decided to talk about the 500 years of occupation from the perspective of a woman, from women. And the women in my family, and I'm pretty sure it's, you know, it's pretty universal, when something's coming down, they're not quiet about that. They're right in the middle of it. And they are, you know, doing what they can do to litigate some of the issues that are there. The only thing is that our history doesn't get told. And so I thought, well, why not retell that history from the perspective of the women of the folklore tradition, right? And there's this whole idea of time and space, and how you can't separate time and space. And this is part of the Mesoamerican way of looking at the world. So what I decided to do was to take a little fictitious girl by the name of Six Deer and move her all the way through time and space, 500 years into the future, right? And of course, she ends up over there at New Mexico, because that's where Aslan is. So what happens is like, Ixchel sends little Six Deer through time and space to look for Crow Woman, who is in New Mexico. Mm-hmm. That's where Aslan is. So she's looking for Aslan. So what you see here on this one, as she's moving through time and space, she comes across the Guadalupe, right? And you can see the deities on top, and those are the 4 bacas, and they're the 4 directions of the world, of, you know, of our world. And as you go through the story, what happens is that they start warring with each other, right? And one of the things that little Six Deer begins to realize is that she's being sent forward to heal the world, right? So little Six Deer in 2012 actually like heals the world and she jumpstarts the sixth son. I don't know that you know that sixth year saved us all, but she did. So, that was kind of like part of, like the fun of the story. What you see below that is a script that was written by Cecilio Garcia Camarillo that kind of details this kind of like movement up al norte. And here we see her with the Guadalupe, and the Guadalupe tells little sixth year that, the gods have not changed, but they're coming in through a new door. And so what she's doing, she's, kind of like talking about Tonantzin as though, she is kind of like the reawakening of Tonantzin. And you see also there's that one little like deity that's kind of like jumped down off of the heaven world, and he's kind of like pushing the conquistador up into the deity world. He's kind of like the little devil that's doing this. You also see another part of this where, and you see the little feet where little sixth year is just kind of like moving around, right? And I have those little feet, and her little patas are just kind of like moving in and out of the different realms. The other thing is one of the reasons why I have that the story that's kind of follows the visuals with it is that the codices was actually kind of cues for a storyteller, right? And since I don't have the storyteller to tell the story, the written part of it becomes what the storyteller would be telling you as you would look at the codices. So yeah, and you'll see the little calaca, he tends to show up in each one of the scenes. So I kind of like threw in some of the calacas and such. The little sixth year is actually my niece. And now she's like in her, well, let's put it this way, she has a baby now.
Wow, this is really, really beautiful. And Delilah, the next series is Sagrado Corazón from 1992. And as a photographer, but a researcher also, you work with a strong conscience about the legacy in traditions, the pathway through syncretic ideas imposed and in the layers of meaning that result of that encounter, right? Tell us more about this series of portraits that you create with the community, exploring a poetic and philosophical dimensions.
Right. Yeah. I'd like to say one last thing about the Codex Delilah. It's actually is traveling with the Malinche show that opened up in Denver, and actually it's going to be here in Albuquerque, and then it's going to go on to San Antonio. So it's really nice to see it kind of unearthed, because it's been sitting in, two libraries have made two copies, and two libraries. The library at Stanford has one, and then the library at Zimmerman Library in New Mexico has the other one. So
fantastic.
El Sagrado Corazón series is actually was my MFA project. Right. I did this in graduate school, and I was kind of an older graduate student, just because I had a daughter. I had a daughter when I was like 18. And so, I would just take school a little at a time, because, I had to work full time and take care of my daughter. And then at this point, when I was in graduate school, I was like, I can take my time. My daughter's in high school. I'm not going anywhere. So one of the things that I began to think about was the Sacred Heart. And I remember seeing the Sacred Heart as these kind of disembodied heart in churches, particularly the church that I was going to. And they were just kind of like these little hearts that were kind of like floating around. And, as an artist, I began to, question that, like, where did these hearts come from? Where did the disembodied hearts come from? What is the Sacred Heart of Jesus? What is the Sacred Heart of Mary? Why are we looking at their physical hearts? And as I began to study more about Mesoamerica and kind of look at the ideas of the disembodied heart of the Nahuatls, of the Aztecs, and what was thought about in terms of that disembodied heart, and then looking at the disembodied heart as it was showing up in Catholicism, it became clear to me that this was a syncretic manifestation of two cultures that came together on one kind of symbol or icon. And we know that Catholicism did this, quite a bit, right? It was one of the colonial processes that they had. And as I was began to study, when does a Sacred Heart show up in Catholicism? And it was after the conquest. You don't see the Sacred Heart prior to the conquest, right? What did they think about when they first introduced the Sacred Heart? What did Catholicism think about? And what I found was that it was almost a direct I guess you could call it a grab from what the Nawas were thinking about in terms of the Sacred Heart. It was the seat of sin. There was good hearts, there were bad hearts. It was where memory was stored. It was, and there was just like all of these things that just kept going back and forth. And so what I decided to do was, why not do, and then, is the Sacred Heart of Jesus and the Sacred Heart of Mary, what they're doing is they're rebuilding their hearts, right? And so I thought, well, what I would like to do is create the Sacred Heart of Albuquerque, the Chicanos in Albuquerque, New Mexico, rebuilding their hearts. And so what you'll see a number of portraits of different people in New Mexico rebuilding their hearts. And so the one that you see with the cat, that's Cecilio Garcia Camarillo, a poet, a Chicano poet who really influenced me in terms of understanding myself as an artist. He was a great supporter of my work, a dear friend. He's passed on at this point, but what he's doing is he's sitting on one of his concrete poems, and it's just this one phrase, one of his favorite phrases, repeated over and over and over again. And what the phrase says is, without innocence, how can there be wisdom? And so, and he brought, when I took the picture, he brought his cat Frida along. And it just so happened, because I'm shooting with an 8x10 camera. 8x10 cameras are big cameras. They're big cameras. So, you have to kind of like physically put it down. There's a lot of, things that you have to do beforehand in order to expose that film. And what was so great about it was that I caught the cat right at the point where her little nose was at the edge of the film. Only a photographer would appreciate something like that.
And this specific collection is of colotype, right? Tell us a little more about the technique that you use for this particular series.
Oh, the colotype is a turn of the century process, 19th century process. It's the first process that they use to publish photographic works. And it's the only printmaking process that you can get a continuous tone image out of. All the other ones you have to use like half tones and things like that in order to get that continuous tone. Very few people actually do colotypes. I'm really pretty proud of these, but there's just about like maybe 3 people that, or no, 4 people, maybe 4 people that actually understand what a colotype is. It's very rare.
Yeah.
And I think that I did a great job with it. I'm very proud. I don't think I'd ever do it again, because what you're doing is that you're taking silver gelatin, negative, and you're sensitizing it in dichromite. And dichromite kind of resensitizes the gelatin surface. And then you take the 8x10 negative that I shot, contact print it with it using ultraviolet light. Then you take that gelatin that's been sensitized in dichromite and you wash it out, right? And what it does is it creates kind of a plate. It's almost like an etched plate. You use glycerin compound to swell the gelatin. And so then you can take oil, like ink, like you would a lithoplate, and you can actually roll it up. You roll it up And you can, and depending on the type of inks that you use, it's called viscosity printing. Like if I used a really loose ink, then it'll cover the plate. So what I would use is like a loose yellow, and I would print that first. And then I would start progressively getting the inks stiffer and darker in order to produce these different, this kind of like sepia tone.
Yeah.
And so what I did was I rolled it out 7 different times with 7 different inks, and it had to be registered.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Wow,
I'd
amazing.
never do it again. I was just nuts. And it's like, you have to have the right like conditions in order to be able to roll it out. And one of the things that I found, I was doing it during the summer, and we were getting a lot of lightning strikes. And so the lightning strikes ionize the air. And so I was able to, like in the desert, a process that you need humidity for, I was able to do it in the desert because of the lightning strikes that were happening. So I felt a little bit like Frankenstein. It was like, it's a Frankenstein process.
Wow, sounds fantastic, Delilah. And the photography in your work is like an extension of your beliefs and ideology, and at the same time operate as a reflection and a manifesto against the perpetuity of colonialism in our time. And can you talk a little more about your artistic practice exploring this famous series, Guadalupe Tattoo from 1998, and La Guadalupana installation?
Yeah, you know, this was actually done for a show in, it was called Ida y Vuelta, and it was in France in, I think it was 1998. This one, when it went up, and what it was I think a group of New Mexican artists were asked to exhibit in France, and it was at Rodez. And I was invited to participate in this, and I was like the only Latina or Latinx person that was in the show, which was really odd because it's New Mexico. What's going on? Actually, there was another man. There was 2 of us, and he was the one that kind of like promoted the show. I'm trying to remember his name, Francisco, I think it was. So anyway, they asked me to do an installation on the Guadalupe. And I thought to myself at that point, like, I mean, it's going back in the other direction now. It's going back to Europe. What do I want to say about an image that was conceived in the Americas, and now it's going back in the other direction to be looked at? And I realized, I began to think about the Guadalupe as being a highly symbolic and invested colonial image. All right, there's the issues of syncretism in there. There's the issues of colonialism. You know, it was all there. It was just really kind of weighted, you know, as a very weighted icon. And then I began to realize how she's still understood through the tattoo, right? Particularly at that time, this is in 98, when we see it was very much a part of prison culture, right? And so then I began to kind of like think about, you know, what does that mean in terms of prison culture? I mean, why the Guadalupe? Why the Guadalupe on the backs of the prisoners? And then I began to think about, you know, the Guadalupe in terms of Tonantzin, and what were the connections between Tonantzin and the Guadalupe? And we know that, you know, where she revealed herself was a temple, Tepeyac, to Tonantzin. And so in my mind, this is not a coincidence. You know, these things are not just coincidental. You know, and she was revealed to a Native American man, right?
Yeah.
You know, Juan Diego. And there again, that's not a coincidence, right? You know, there was this need for the community to see itself there. You know, and one of the things that I began here lately that I've began to think about is the subaltern. And subaltern is the way in which dominant power is moved and motivated by the power systems that are underneath, you know, that kind of like, that can move the dominant culture. And I think when you think about it this way, you see the Guadalupe as being one of those, you know, one of those symbols where, you know, the culture that is being, you know, oppressed is actually utilizing its own power to control the dominant culture and what they're thinking and doing. And, you know, and I saw this, you know, really clearly when I began to think about the Guadalupe. And then, you know, move forward when we see the Guadalupe show up in the prisons.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And when I began to think about that, all of a sudden, I listened to a lecture once where they were saying, like, the Guadalupe was worn. The Guadalupe was worn on the tilma, right? And that when you think about the Xispetotec and its relationship to Tonantensin, it's being worn. She was worn. This is the second skin. And then thinking about that, and then looking at, you know, what was going on in the back of the prisoners, there she is again, she's being worn on the skin. Once again, I don't see these things as being coincidences. I see it as being part of the collective consciousness. And so when I begin to kind of like think about it as part of the collective consciousness, right, it starts making sense.
Yeah.
You know, and it's not just because, you know, there's a lot of because the idea of her being worn seemed correct, right? And so we get the tattoo. But then there's the idea of identity, right? And certainly identity was very strong within the prison system, that identity, when they were wearing her, yo soy Mexican, yo soy Chicano, right? And so then kind of like, you know, those identities and those kind of collection of men, right? Those gangs began to kind of like form themselves in the prison system. But then there's the other thing too, and that I saw was like with the Xispetotec, it was not only that Tonantensin was a female power image, but she was also worn by the male entities too. And so bringing together the male and the female together created, you know, kind of power, right? So, you know, I began kind of like thinking about it all this. I think too much. I'm sorry.
No, thank you.
I really do. I think too much. But, you know, as you're kind of like thinking through this and you're thinking about the violence and all of this in terms of colonialism, then all of a sudden things become really real.
Yeah.
When Felix Martinez was killed in prison, right? He was taken out. And he was taken out by his own gang. And then it was at that point that I realized all of a sudden, all these things that you're thinking about, all these theories and stuff, there's kind of a reality there. It was kind of a reality check for me. Yeah.
Thank you, Delilah. And well, the next series that we would like to explore a little more is the Contemporary Casta, Nuestra Calidad, from 2017. a series in color that is clearly a reflection of your activism through the art. And I would like to know if you can tell us a little more about your message in this portfolio of Latina, Latino, Latinx people, where the picture becomes a political commentary of the situation of the colonialism, but also in this particular moment of racism, and how you are demonstrating and revisiting some categories and labels in this society.
Right. I had always like thought about the castas and what it meant to us as Latinx people, because we kind of grew up with it.
Mm-hmm.
We grew up with these ideas of, like in my case, my father is actually Polish and my mother is Latina, and they would tell me I was a coyota. you're a coyota, and so this kind of like labeling was always kind of like out there, and I was always wondering, like, where did that come from? What does that mean? And as I started like looking at it deeper, I realized it was like, it's the racism. Oh, it's our colonial racism. And this colonial racism is something that happened when the first Europeans stepped foot onto the continents, right? And they brought their African slaves, and they came with this idea of conquest, right? And it's really throughout all of the Americas, and it's part of the United States as well. The United States didn't somehow just democratize themselves out of this. They're deeply seated in it, and we saw that clearly in Buffalo just last week. Where this idea of racism and kind of prevails. So when I started looking at this, when I started looking at the casta portraits themselves, and you see it as very much a part of the ideas of like breeding and labeling, and that there's a hierarchy that was established. And as I began to like read a little bit more about it, I realized that this is where the first drop of Black blood idea came out of. So the castas are basically, they demonstrate how one goes about cleaning the blood. And the only blood that can be cleaned is the Native American blood. And so the way the castas demonstrate, if Espanol has a child from India, the child is, mestizo or mestiza. If that child marries an Espanol, then the child is casista. If the casista marries an Espanol, then the Española, then the child is Espanol. The blood got cleaned. And it's real clear in the castas that, one could clean, and you're like, how does that happen, right? And it's because they felt that the Native American blood was not a polluted blood, right? They lacked status, but the blood itself was not polluted. However, African blood was considered to be polluted. So the majority of the lines of the castas are basically trying to keep up with the African mix. And you see that over and over again as they come up with all these kind of strange names of, instead of the child becoming like a casista, the child all of a sudden is now an albina, right? And then it moves on from there. So the Black blood could never be cleaned. And I was like, part of me, when I saw this, I was like, oh my gosh, this is exactly where it comes from. And it's the idea of labeling. I was looking at the ideas of labeling, and then I thought, well, it's still here. I mean, we're not divorced from these ideas. We know these ideas, and we know the rules. We all know the rules. Right. And so what I wanted to do was to demonstrate the idea of labeling, but in terms of DNA testing, is that our new labeling is the DNA test. Because for them, what they were doing, they were categorizing, which was part of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment felt as though this was like scientific kind of discovery sort of thing. And now we're using DNA testing to determine bloodlines. And what I wanted to do was there was a couple things in the back of my mind. One, I wanted to demonstrate how truly mixed we all are, that there's no such thing as anybody who's pure anything, right? Especially with the Latinx community, which was a little bit different from the colonial communities in the United States. The difference between the two was that the colonial communities of the 13 colonies completely wiped out the tribes. They're gone. So there is no bloodline. In Latin America, if they brought on Christianity, right, then they were allowed to live. And so then you saw the mixing and the passing and everything like that began to happen. And so when I started DNA testing the Latinx people, populations, what I wanted to do was do kind of a parody of the two. So you don't know anybody's name in the colonial castas. And so I put it out where you don't know anybody's name in the contemporary casta. So, what we're looking at is directly looking at the family. What I wanted to do was kind of like demonstrate what the family did within their own homes. And so there were genre portraits, just like the casta paintings were genre portraits. So what I did here is one of the things that I really liked about the casta portraits were that they were so well composed, right? Because they're paintings. And so what I wanted to do was kind of create something that looked like a painting with the photograph. And now with our new technologies, there's a bunch of technologies in these portraits. With these new technologies, what I was able to do was photograph a family multiple times without moving the camera, and then taking it into Photoshop and then just putting things in such a way where the compositions are exquisite. They're like paintings. Yeah. And of course I could never do that with one shot. That wasn't ever going to happen, but I could do it with multiple shots. So long as I could keep the lighting the same and I keep the camera in the same position, I could actually pop people in and out of the compositions. And then the other thing too that I did was that instead of labeling, I DNA tested the families, and I did it through National Geographics, because it was National Geographic. I mean, that's another one of those kind of colonial spaces, right?
Yeah.
So it was that level too that I was kind of like hitting it at. And, as I was watching, and I had asked the families if I could go into their websites and download the data, and that was something that they agreed that I could do. And what National Geographic was doing is that they were like, at that time, they had 9 biogeographic regions. And then also, and that would go back 6 generations. And then they also had another one that was done on the haplo markers. And these are mutations that would demonstrate how they would come out of Africa. Everybody came out of East Africa, right? And so that went back 100,000 years. And so it showed the migration of how, where the mother line came from, and then also where the father line came from. What was really interesting was that the majority of Latinos, the mother line was Native American. It was a Native American mother line. Very few came up with the father line being Native American. I think there was only one case where that happened. And then the father line was was coming right out of like the Mediterranean, and was coming right out of Europe, right? And of course that's a mestizo. But what it would show on the 6 generations past is the majority of Latinos had African blood, sub-Saharan.
Wow.
And usually they were like, where did that come from? And I'm like, there was the slave trade. There was, like 7 million Africans were brought into the Americas.
Mm-hmm.
Where did they go?
Wow.
Right. They went into our bloodline. They're our grandmothers, right? Our great-great-grandmothers.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, that was kind of like showing up in the mix. The other thing that was showing up in the mix that I found fascinating was that Native American blood, most Latinos, most Latinx people have Asian. There's an Asian bloodline, and that's coming from the Native American. So Native Americans are kin to Asians. First people who came to the Americas, or maybe came out of the Americas, well, there was this kind of cross that was happening between Asia and the Americas. And it's that Pacific Rim.
Yeah.
You look at that and you can see it's a coastline. They talk about, like what do they call it? That strait, right? And it wasn't really the strait, it was the coastline that did it. And they're hopping that coastline all the way down. So, yeah, and the other thing that I found, usually whenever I start up these projects, I just kind of learn so much, right? I just learned so much about like the world around me.
Yeah.
And this project, it was just kind of an eye-opener on so many different levels. What I learned was that there were these they're hominines, right? And the hominines were they were cousins. I can just call them cousins to modern man, because the only reason that we can all have babies from each other is because we have a common ancestor, and that common ancestor can go back 3 million years. So there was a common ancestor. From the common ancestor came hominines, who are cousins, and then modern man came. And whenever, with National Geographic, when they were doing the DNA testing, they would also tell you what your hominines were. There's 2 hominines that they know of, and one is the Neanderthal, and most Europeans have Neanderthal in it. Majority, so there was this kind of interbreeding with the Neanderthal in Europe. And in Asia, it was the Desnovine. So the Desnovine shows up with the Asian. With the Latinos, with the Latinx community, both shows up. Most Latinx people have not only all of the major groups, but they have all of the hominines too. So when they talk about us being the cosmic race, yeah, we kind of are.
Yeah.
And so I was just kind of laughing over this. I was like, wow, there it is.
Delilah is amazing, and thank you for sharing with us this amazing aesthetic approach, but for your contribution, right? And well, we can continue to talk about your amazing career and your body of work, but time flies, and I would like to open the Q&A to participate with our audience, and Jorge Cibaja, the curatorial assistant, he will start with the Q&A session.
Hi, folks. Thanks for being with us so far. If you have a question, please feel free to use the Q&A feature or the chat to send it in. We do have a question to open us up from Patrick Frank. How large do you print your photos from the Casta series, and how does size enter your thinking when you're printing them?
Wow, that's a really great question.
Mm-hmm.
There are actually, the prints themselves is based on the largest print I could get off my printer, which was 24 by 36. And then, of course, I made the frame that went around it. And so with that frame, it turns out to be 36 by 38, in size. I wanted them to feel like a painting. So I wanted it to have a certain amount of presence to it. So that's one of the reasons why I decided to take it as large as I could, because I wanted it to feel like a painting. And then also I printed it on metal. And the reason I did that because of the clarity and how it would just kind of lay really flat. I just kind of like that flatness, and I like the clarity that metal prints would give me.
Definitely. Again, feel free to send in any questions. I will hop in with my own here. You mentioned your sort of beginnings as an artist, sort of as starting from photography, reflecting on your growth as an artist. What is your relationship to photography now? Has it changed over time? Is that the medium that you see yourself sort of primarily working in for, I don't know, the remainder of your career?
Right.
That's a big question. Sorry.
Actually, I started off wanting to be a commercial artist. And that didn't work. Right. And since I mentioned I had a daughter when I was 18, and one of the things that I found is that because I used to like to draw, and I would do a lot of drawing, and I did like to paint, and I've done painting, but it took so much time. I needed something that I could do quickly, and something that I could make money from. And I found out I could do this with photography. I was able to actually make a living, and I was able to do it quickly enough to where I could get everything done that I needed to get done. And so it just kind of hooked. And the other part was that the camera liked me. I mean, I could pick up the camera and I could get what I needed out of it. So for all those reasons, I kind of gravitated towards the camera. Currently, I find myself wanting to do more, working with my hands. And I don't know, I might just, I don't have to work so hard because I'm retired now. I don't have to work so hard, and I don't have to think about getting things done quickly. I might just kind of slow it down and start looking at painting and drawing again.
Amazing. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
I have one more question. And it's there's clearly an undercurrent of deep thought, reflection, and observation throughout your work. And I would love to hear what your relationship is sort of to the land, or how does the land sort of the Southwest, of where you were from, sort of influence the subject matter that you're interested in, but also, sort of your themes that you work with.
Yeah, I know that most of the themes that we were looking at today had to do with people and portraits, right? And of course, the people that you were seeing were mostly people from New Mexico. And so, for that reason, the New Mexican landscape has really influenced the way in which the people and the portraits reveal themselves to me. And I really look at my portrait work as being collaborations. I really try to listen. I don't usually, like when I do my portraits, I don't have them sign model releases immediately. What I do is I photograph them. We work together collaboratively, how they want to see themselves. And then what I do is I show them the pictures and show them what it is that I would like to use. And if they're okay with that, then I ask them to sign model releases. I never want to portray somebody in a light or in a manner in which they don't see themselves or see their own identity. I want the people I work with to have control of their identity. And I think that's really, really important for me, in the manner in which I work. In terms of the landscape of New Mexico, I have a deep love and commitment for the landscape that's here. This is a New Mexico sky. Right? And, you know, I have a collection of photographs that I've never really, I call it backpedaling of where I just photograph the New Mexico sky, because it's so beautiful. And I see that as being like expressionist paintings, right? And I've been doing this like for years and years and years. One of these days I might just kind of sit down and just try to put something together with that, but it's where I kind of let my aesthetic inspiration, reveal itself, where I can like feel that. I did photograph my grandfather's morada and blew it up like life size. And right now it's really sad, but that whole area that my grandfather and our ancients farmed and lived, and then it's on fire. It's burning. It's one of the largest. We've never seen this before. We've never seen it. There's like 400 square feet of burning, and it's the whole mountain range is on fire. It's houses and lands that are hundreds of, farms that are like 400 or 500 years old. They're burning right now. Yeah. So, right now it's pretty heavy.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
Well, that is the close for the Q&A.
Oh no, that's a horrible close. We're waiting for the wind to come in the other direction to burn it out.
Definitely. Thank you for all your answers. And thank you, Gabriela.
Thank you, Jorge. Delilah, thank you so much for your generosity. You are an inspiration. And thank you for opening up your home, your studio to MOLAA. We really appreciate your time.
Yeah, you're welcome. And it was fun. All right, let's stay in touch, okay?
Thank you. And thank you all of you for joining us today. See you in our next Zoom project with the Brazilian artist, Andre Komatsu. Thank you so much and see you soon. Bye-bye. Bye, Delilah.